Katharina, you have had spiritual experiences time and again since you were young. When did that begin, and can you give examples of what you have experienced? It began when I was about 11 or 12 years old, and my first experience was that I foresaw that my grandmother was going to die soon. About a year before she died, I just knew all about it. I had this mental image that she would soon be gone. This came true, and it was my first experience that remained just as clear in my memory as it happened. Ever since I was young, these major life events have been announced to me again and again before they occurred. They then simply came as predicted, or I have just foreseen them, and every time they were important to me. Another example is I didn't yet have a boyfriend, so I was just alone, and one day when I was sad about this, I clearly heard the words from the world beyond, "He's coming on a Sunday in May." After that, I was still alone for a few more years. And then, on a Sunday in May, it was in fact Mother's Day, I met my husband, to whom I am presently married to this day. This was then the nicest experience I had with the spiritual world, because this was a beautiful event indeed. Many other events were rather sad ones, but in the end, it has given me so much comfort and strength that the spirits are there for me, taking care of me, and also telling me before anything should happen. You said you saw a mental image, or you sometimes perceive inner images. How can one imagine that? You have to imagine this in a way that I can see before my inner eye the things that will be coming. For example, as to the premonition I had concerning my husband, I saw a man approaching me. It can also be understood as a kind of inner knowing, coming over you so suddenly. It was just the same as back then when I was 15 or 16 years old. At that time, there were these prepaid cell phones for recharge. You had this card and you could scratch off the numbers on it. This happened during the early days when there were the first cell phones and everybody had one. I bought a card for recharge with the last pocket money I had. And when I had finished scratching the numbers free, they were all suddenly gone because I had scratched them all away. Then, of course, I was disappointed and sad when suddenly I felt a kind of presence around me. It felt like a guardian angel who is simply with me, and following an impulse, I entered some numbers. About 4 or 5 numbers. I don't remember exactly how many that were all correct, and in doing so, my cell phone was recharged. This was for me, if you think about it, at that young age. Nevertheless, for me it was a sign. Listen, we're with you after all. You're not alone. And this was like a little candy from the spiritual world, I think. A sign the spiritual world wanted to give me. In connection with the deaths in your family, you had some particularly impressive experiences during the last 2 years where you felt again the presence of the world beyond. This happened when I was living in my parents' house. We have an apartment upstairs, and my parents are living downstairs. One day my father came upstairs to me, and I saw death in his aura. It was sort of an inner knowledge I had, a feeling. And shortly after, I saw a kind of black dot in his aura, on his back in the area of his liver. And it was there that I saw the black dot. Actually, he was supposed to go for a preventive medical checkup around this time, in the springtime, because he had had skin cancer 10 years previously. Back then, the skin cancer was removed and everything was fine again. This time, however, he didn't go to the checkup because due to corona, the appointment had been postponed. One day, while he was watching TV in my parents' living room, I suddenly saw a lot of angel beings standing there, descending from above. And this was again some sort of mental image I had, a very bright light, and it was as if energy beings were coming in. But at that moment, I didn't yet know how to interpret it. Shortly after, he made an appointment with the doctor where he was diagnosed with bad blood values, and so he was to be examined further. Sometimes it takes a while for such blood results to be known. In the meantime, there was another situation. That is, he repaired my mother's shutters and said, "I'll fix that for you now before I die." At that moment, we still didn't know that he was already seriously ill because he had no symptoms at all until the very end. Then he got the diagnosis from the doctor that he had about a year to live. So he was told that he would still be able to look for Easter eggs next year, but that otherwise nothing more could be done. Then it was quiet for a while, but thereafter there were some examinations to be done again. And while I was standing at the stove cooking, I suddenly felt very strongly the presence of my grandmother, who had passed 20 years previously. She is his mother. And she was standing behind me and put her hand on my shoulder. And this I felt so intensely that it was almost as if she was really touching me, thereby conveying to me the impression, "Listen, my dear child, something bad is going to happen, but I am there." And this was like a premonition, and it really affected me deeply, because you can no longer deny things like that. It's then a knowledge you have, and that you can no longer deny. The doctors suggested that my father try chemotherapy in the form of tablets to be taken home. So my father started chemo, and I woke up in the night, and I felt a very, very intense fear that went right to my bones. And this was a feeling like, well, it was a mixture of several feelings, that something bad was going to happen here. It was a feeling as if my soul wanted to leave my body. That's the only way I can put it. It was absolutely intense. It was to the bone, and I was trembling. I got up, listened to myself a bit, and then realized that this feeling didn't come from myself. It's something I can perceive, but it comes from outside, and it's just my reaction to it. Well, a few days after taking these pills, my father woke up at night. He no longer recognized anyone, and he seemed to have lost his mind, so to speak. He was also quite confused, and we were very distressed and called for an ambulance. Nobody knew at that point in time what was actually going on, whether this condition was caused by the pills or where it came from. In any case, we brought him to the hospital. And at the time we left, my clock in the living room had stopped. And when I saw that, I knew immediately he's not coming home anymore, because this was such an intense indicator for me that the time had probably come, and that now there was probably nothing more that could be done. So he was in hospital for 3 days, and during the whole time I felt very strongly that he was going to pass. I saw his mother waiting for him, and in the form of a mental image, I perceived my father lying in his bed and his mother standing behind him, conveying to me the impression that she was waiting to pick him up. And in the meantime, I was also told it was like an inner voice saying, "Saturday, meaning that he would die on a Saturday. And indeed, that's how it was. He died on a Saturday in the night. It was the 1st of August, and in the middle of the night we got the call. I immediately rushed down to my mother, thereby seeing him standing in front of his bedroom. It was as if he was really standing there in the room, just without a body, so to speak. And I perceived that he was watching us in complete confusion, as if he was wondering, "What are you all doing here?" We all were very upset in the middle of the night, and for this reason, he must have been wondering about this. What are they doing there? I noticed it, and I was quick thinking enough and said to him in my thoughts, "Dad, you have died." And thereupon I noticed how he understood immediately what had happened. It was like a sudden insight. So I said to him, "Think of your mother," because I didn't know what else to say to him. I think that's what he did then, because I didn't perceive anything else from him at that moment. It went even further. My mother then went to the hospital together with my brother to say goodbye to him. I preferred to stay at home because I was so nervous that I couldn't manage it all that night. Something very strange happened then that I still can't really explain now. My mother has a cell phone that can be folded back. It's a cell phone especially for people who are not very tech savvy. And this cell phone has a keypad, so it's an older model. I was sitting on my couch at night when suddenly a call came in from my mother's cell phone. I then picked up the phone and heard muffled voices through the phone. It seemed to me that she was talking to my brother, and I kept calling, "Mom, Mom," because I thought she might have had the cell phone in her handbag. She indeed took the cell phone out of her handbag, picked up the receiver, and spoke to me. But apparently, she had not called me. However, though I couldn't explain how this call came about, I had this inner feeling, namely the feeling, now I can be there one more time to say goodbye. I must also say that at that moment I perceived a wonderful peace, a deep inner peace. And the morning after my father had died, we were looking for the documents for the undertaker. However, we couldn't find them. For that, you need the family book, and so on, identity cards, and all these documents. We were quite upset because my mother wanted to go to the undertaker shortly. I then felt my father saying quite clearly, so in my thoughts, he said, "Safe." So I told my mother to go and see if these documents were in there, and indeed, all the documents were there. Well, then there was another sign that I found to be quite nice, and this was a day or two later. I then perceived him again quite strongly with us, and he said, "Feather." So I should say, "Feather" to my mother. At that moment, I didn't know what was meant by that. But when he was to be buried a few days later, there was a feather hanging from the screen on the balcony door. We knew straight away that this was a sign from him for us, and it was also very comforting for my mother that he was able to give her once again a sign through me, so to speak, because she can't perceive him. Well, in all these terrible moments, this was such a great comfort and support for me and my mother, and it helps us get through it all. Well, through this whole phase, so to speak. Then, in another moment, I heard him say, "I didn't think it would be so easy to die." Since he was sick previously, maybe he meant the transition, or maybe he imagined it much worse himself. He left still one more message for my mother, and that was, when an old sun sets, a new one rises. I heard this very clearly in the form of an inner voice, and I was then able to pass it on to my mother, and it gave her a lot of comfort. There was still another situation. I was sitting on the couch in the evening, and next to me, next to the floor lamp, I perceived a figure. This figure looked like a captain. That is, it was wearing the appropriate cap and uniform. I just kept watching television and somehow tried to ignore this figure, but it didn't go away. The figure stayed firmly where it was and was really very friendly. I then turned toward this figure, listened, and then heard telepathically, in the form of thoughts, "I don't want to disturb your evening get-together." So I asked my husband, "Do you know a captain, a man who died, but who was a captain?" And he said, "No, not in my whole family. There was no captain." Then suddenly the captain said to me, "I'm here because of your mother." I then called my mother and asked her if she knew a captain. And at first she said, "No, I can't think of anyone who was a captain." But when she thought a bit about it, it occurred to her that when she was a small child, she used to go to the seaside for a cure because of her lungs. And there she was with a woman whose son was a captain, and he must have died a few years ago. This captain then said to me that he just wanted to look after her because due to the death she was feeling very bad. For my mother, and this was then another little ray of hope, that the world beyond is with us, and that spirits with whom we don't have much contact in life may also be looking after us. Later on, you had another experience with your deceased grandmother. It actually happened right after my father had passed away, when I saw that my grandma and my uncle were going to die next. I have to say that the two were living together in one house. My grandmother was already well over 90, but my uncle was only 68 years old. And as a mental image, I saw this house being empty and both of them leaving. And this whole event dragged on for about a year. And in the meantime, I have repeatedly seen other deceased relatives standing here in the room with us, giving me the impression something's going to happen again and very soon. Once my great-grandma appeared to me, my mother's grandmother, that is, and she said my grandmother's name very clearly. And she also said, "Your uncle's cancer has returned." Actually, my uncle was cancer-free for almost 20 years. Shortly after that, a few weeks later, he got his diagnosis. And 2 or 3 months later, on the same evening, my mother, my grandma, and I had an intense feeling of fear that something was going to happen. And so it happened that 3 weeks later, as far as I remember, my grandmother was brought to the hospital and passed away after just a few days. My uncle's illness dragged on for a longer period of time, but I was able to see my grandmother again after her death. I perceived her as being inside a very, very bright light. and how she was reunited with her family in that place where she was now. And this feeling coming across at that moment was so incredibly beautiful. They were all so joyful to be reunited again. Maybe you can imagine what it's like when after many, many years you see people again who you loved very much. And that's what this feeling was like. And I perceived her so happy and much younger, at about the age of her mid-40s, and full of energy. In any case, not old, but young. And she said to me, and this was the only time that she said something to me, "Nothing hurts anymore." Since I was very close with my grandmother during her lifetime, I thought that she would get in touch with me more often after she died. But it was actually only this one time when she said something to me, but it was still a farewell, which allowed me to see that she had arrived well and that she was fine. Because the feeling came across from there that was so intense. I can still feel it right now as I'm talking about it. So this feeling was beautiful indeed. You had yet another experience with your late uncle. Yes, when my grandmother died, my uncle was already ill, and in the form of a mental image, I saw that his illness would drag on for quite a while. I must say that the whole thing was also very bad, because during these months when he was still alive, he suffered quite a bit. And I also felt this suffering energetically all the time. Well, having again and again the feeling that soon something bad was going to happen upset me emotionally, not only because it was about a member of my family, but also because I felt it all energetically through our family connectedness. Well, what happened first was that in the springtime, my clock in the living room stopped for about an hour, and then just kept going until today. Well, a few weeks later, the clock stopped in my mother's kitchen and then resumed running until today. I interpreted this as a spiritual sign that soon something bad was about to happen again, but that it would still drag on some time before it happened, because the clock had continued ticking as usual each time. The event in itself was very bad for us, but still, signs like this somehow make you feel as if the world beyond was trying to tell us everything is going to plan here, from which it can be seen that it happened just the way it should. My uncle then passed away in July of last year, and the same morning I saw him standing in my room, and he said to me, "Don't cry. It's as if someone you know is standing next to you, only without a body. But you know that it is this person, because you know the energy so well, the essence of this person." Then he said that he was so happy that everything is gone now, and by that he probably meant the pain, because all the burden he was having was just torture for him. And he went on saying that I should tell my mother that she has been provided for concerning her inheritance. Then I saw him standing in a bright room, and he said, "Everything is so bright here, as if in a curtain of light." That's what he said verbatim. And further, "Your grandmother is so beautiful." And the fact that they both found each other again over there, so to speak, was particularly nice for me, because they were living together before, and it had hit him hard when she passed on a short time before he did. Concerning his message that he had left something for my mother, We found out a few days later that he had indeed left something for her, my mother. All of that was again a spiritual sign for me that they are looking after us. When you perceive such spiritual things, isn't that burdensome for you? There is a difference whether I feel the energies of people who are, for example, ill, or whether I have these premonitions of something bad that can happen, whereby the latter, for one thing, is also a good thing, since you are forewarned. But as to these energies, you feel them almost as if you were experiencing them yourself. And this is indeed burdensome. But receiving certain messages and seeing things in the form of mental images is not burdensome for me, because I can deal with it quite well and also work with other people. When I feel people who have died, or shall I say angels, spirit beings, that's a really wonderful experience. It has often been the case that I wasn't feeling well, that I was in pain, or I didn't feel good emotionally. And when I then perceived a presence of, I'll say, an angel, because that's a nice word, and when my soul then was somehow permeated by its spirit, then suddenly the discomfort was gone. These are the small everyday miracles that I was experiencing now and then, and these experiences are indeed beautiful. And so I used to tell people perceiving such things that this can sometimes be a blessing, yet at the same time a curse. But also that I believe that this all has a very specific meaning. That is, you should work with it and bring it into the world in order to help others and yourself with it. What effects do all these spiritual experiences have on your life and on your worldview? Well, I have to say, of course, it changed me spiritually. It also changed me humanly. 3 deaths within 2 years. That's pretty rough. You don't have to talk about that. Nevertheless, this ambivalence has changed me. On the one hand, to experience that death is there, very close, and how people are suffering before their death. And on the other hand, this perceiving of this other sphere where we then go to, how beautiful that is. These are 2 stark contrasts, and they were affecting me so deeply, thereby changing me in a way that I have resorted my whole values. I, for myself, have realized that these insights are not about achieving the usual goals in our life. It's rather about what kind of person you become when experiencing such things. And I realize as well that what matters is that you develop into the best possible person that you can be. And this insight has led me to change a lot of things in my life by integrating spirituality into my work and life in order to be able to make use of these intuitive powers that I have, as well as of all the things that I am able to perceive also for helping other people, so that they may integrate their spirituality as well into their lives in a down-to-earth way. Well, I think the meaning in life is one's own personal growth. Katharina, thank you so much for this interview. It's been a great pleasure for me.